delighted to introduce our first panelist, David Cohen, who is a professor of public policy at University College London. And David, I'm so pleased that you could join us, because I think it's really interesting, before we further dive into our debate, telecom debate, to have the perspective of somebody who has been observing those debates between regulators and stakeholders in other sectors of the economy. It might teach us a few useful lessons. David, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Am I on? Thank you very much for inviting me here to speak at BEREC. For me, this is quite interesting, because I remember as a young postdoc at the London Business School looking at the emergence of the IRG and the ERG. And then in the early 2000s, my first big research grant was funded by the European Commission to look at the rise of European regulatory networks. And I was just saying over coffee before we started, it was quite interesting. I haven't looked at BEREC for some 20 years, or 10 years, sorry. But it's interesting that all the other networks that I looked at have, in that period, 10 years ago, 15, have evolved into either very hard networks, like pharmaceuticals, or into agencies, such as in finance and banking. So for me, it would be quite interesting here today to sort of see why we have the stakeholder engagement and the softer network engagement in telecoms that exists for BEREC. I was asked to contextualize a little bit the broader stakeholder engagement in the EU based on big studies that we've conducted at UCL, longitudinal studies over 30 years looking at the changing nature of business-government relations in a multi-level system in Brussels for EU legislation. And then to try and ask some questions or raise some questions about what makes good regulator-regulatee relationships, which in the context of the response we saw here, high need for more stakeholder engagement, might raise a few provocative questions for both our chair and for the panel. Okay, I'm going to whiz through because I'm aware we haven't got a lot of time. Basically, within the sort of multi-level lobbying structure of the EU, just most of you here probably know there's a transparency register with about 12,000 organizations registered. Of that, about 6,000 are what we would probably consider the stakeholders for BEREC, economic, trade associations, consumer groups, companies. Of that 6,000 economic groups, about 300, 400 are actually companies. And what we surveyed at UCL was these companies and how they allocated political resources in an EU political strategy to get a sense of the nature of the relationship, what they needed, what they wanted for a good relationship, and where they put the emphasis of their political resources, time, money, expertise, to see if there was a distinct business-government relationship that had emerged for Brussels. And the first thing I should say is we don't have our revolving doors that many people talk about in Brussels, such as we see in Washington. When we actually surveyed the heads of government affairs, over 75% of them, the regulatory and government affairs people, were actually technical economists, lawyers who had come through the company and brought expertise to the policy table. And clearly Brussels is very much almost like a super agency, particularly the Commission, where the currency is not money or political patronage, but expertise. So the breakdown of that particular survey was about 24% of the political activity of these companies was focused on the Commission. There was a clear delegation, there was clear capacity, they obviously had the right of initiative. But what was said to us also is we established long-term relationships with experts that speak the same language as us. And I'll come back to that when we talk about network agencies. Over the 10, 20 years or 30 years of doing this study as well, we've seen a shift towards the European Parliament. When we first started doing these longitudinal studies, we saw about 5% of political activity going to the European Parliament. Obviously, post-Lisbon, the fact that people have woken up to the fact that most of the legislation goes through on first readings, 85, 90% of regulation. There's been a massive gearing up in terms of representation into the Parliament. Now about 20% political activity is driven into the Parliament following the legislative cycle. And obviously that is only going to grow with the emergence and increasing utilization of trilogues. The European trade associations, many of you in here, also take up a lot of time of the companies. They utilize them, 20% of resources go into that. It's a combination of horizon scanning, showing collective and European voice to facilitate their direct access to the Parliament and Commission when seeking to lobby. And then, obviously pertinent to the group here and the regulators in the room, about 20% of political activity goes back into the nation state to focus on NRAs where the sectors have NRAs, or the civil service where the civil service exists. This is a comitology of a combination of wanting to continue to push through comitology and to push into the networks where these regulatory networks or agencies exist. And obviously there's sector specification, which I can elaborate if someone wants to come and chat with me afterwards. Trade associations domestically have also rebooted as the European networks have rebooted themselves. So the takeaway message, I guess, in terms of the generic multi-level story is that Brussels is expertise-based. It's about trust. It's about long-term relationships, iterative relationships. You win a battle, you lose a war if you misinform, and that's a key point in dealing with any regulator. So trying to take that into the context of BEREC and of networks of regulators, I was asked by the panel organizers if I would sort of say, what did I think makes for good regulator-regulatee relationships? And I should also say that in my early days, I also studied the emergence of national NRAs in the UK and that regulator-regulatee relationship. So I'm sort of stealing from that, but I think it's pertinent to a multi-level story as well. So there are three things that we need to operate on or to develop and to establish, and some of these things are being thrown up. We need to establish credibility between the regulator and regulatee. We need to establish legitimacy of the regulator, and I'll come to that in a moment. And then there's a whole raft of questions around the transparency of the process, which comes back to this iterative game. It's both ways. Trust works two ways. You know, we talk about capture sometimes of NRAs, but actually you can get reverse capture as well as relationships evolve. So coming to credibility, credibility is a function probably of three things. I always tend to say everything is a function of three things and drill down and drill down. That's the business school person in me. So credibility is a function probably of three things. The first is the resources, or should we say the capacity of the network or the agency. The goals of the agency. And so it's a trade-off. You don't need a large capacity or a large secretariat if you're not aspiring to do much. But clearly, with this work package, it's very clear that there's a step up, a gear change for BEREC. And so one of the questions, I guess, to reflect on is, do you have the central capacity and the networking capacity to engage and to have dialogue and to manage that information? Because if you're going to deal with stakeholders, you've got to be able to speak the same language, have that epistemic community, that expertise, and you've got to process that input as well. Because there's nothing more infuriating. There is an agency, a very strong agency, that suffers with its regulatees because the regulatees believe that it doesn't process the inputs that come into it. And that alienates them, so they go back into the nation state rather than dealing as much as they should with their European agency. So the capacity v goals is a trade-off that needs to be clear. The second is clarity of delegation. And this in a multi-level system is obviously an interesting dynamic. I remember in the early days of the ERG talking to Peter Scott about this sort of wave. He called it the seashore wave, where the Commission asserted itself, the nation state asserted itself, the Commission, the nation state. So here we have a very interesting dynamic of multiple principles. You've got NRAs, you've got member governments, and you've got Commission, and you have a strong initiator and primacy agency or network in BEREC. So where does the right of delegation sit? Who is driving the core principles? And this comes to the third point then, the autonomy. Can you deliver on your promises? Trust is a key to a good regulator-regulatory relationship. I remember in the UK, you probably remember in the UK, one of the strengths of the national regulatory models was their autonomy. The fact that companies believed that if they got the efficiency gains through RPI minus X, it wasn't going to be clawed back with windfall taxes at a subsequent change in government. And this strength of an independent regulator was key to that relationship building. And I think in many ways the European networks are at that point. They have to become credible in asserting their autonomy and their ability to deliver on what they promise. Because if you don't, why write the 500-page report responding to your consultations? The next point is legitimacy. Generally, policy making needs to be efficient and effective. but there's always a tension between input legitimacy, the consultation being seen to be inclusive, and the output legitimacy actually defining that best practice, the technical norms, the harmonization. And I think, again, for a long time, BEREC was in a position where it was perhaps focusing more on the input legitimacy, but now as it has to deliver this harmonization, it's got to start thinking about, have I got practical proposals, recommendations that are actually deliverable at the implementation stage, that are doable, to use the technical term. And I think here, again, you know, this seemed to come out from Jeffrey's speech as well, that's something that needs to be looked at. And then that leads into comments that were made. Both of the above, the autonomy, the legitimacy, are to a high degree a function of the transparency. And in a multi-level context, this is incredibly important. I myself, preparing for today, tried to work my way through some work packages just to see who was participating, what the range, what the diversity was. And so I think there has to be some clear criteria on the membership of working groups and working parties. Is this, is this going to be driven by expertise? Is it a function of those that have the resources, the understanding of the nature of the markets, or the variance in the nature of the markets to be able to deliver an effective output legitimacy? Or is it going to be representative of the 27 states? Is it going to be those that have strong preference? When I studied the ERG, one of the critiques of the early ERG was it was driven by 1 or 2, 3, 4 key regulators, depending on the issues. And it was driven by those NRAs that were strong, resourced, had political backing, and had strong preferences. Now, I don't know if that's the case today. I'm sure it isn't. But is it, who gets onto these committees? Is it those that shout the loudest, or those that can put the people up into these committees in Brussels? And so a transparent criteria for work packages, I think, would go a long way to alleviating perhaps potentially some of the fears that we heard. So we need procedures that can work and engage with you, the stakeholders, and there has to be a clear demarcation of what your mandate is and your future function. And I think I'll stop there, and hopefully I've provoked a few thoughts.
Thank you very much, David. Most helpful. Let's move now to our next speaker, Kevin Martin, who is currently a Vice President Mobile and Global Access Policy at Facebook. But as you probably know, in a previous life, Kevin was a commissioner and then the chairman of the FCC. So it would be really interesting, Kevin, to give us your perspective as a former chairman of the FCC on the involvement of stakeholders, or do they do it back then? And also, incidentally, on the huge amount of work that BEREC is to achieve in the coming 2 years.
Well, first, is this on? Can you hear me? So first, let me thank everyone and BEREC for inviting me to be here today, both as a stakeholder and as a former regulator, to provide the perspective on how I think that BEREC's challenges and will unfold. In many ways, I think BEREC is really at a very pivotal moment because of what the code has passed. As other panelists have already talked about, there was always an ERG, a European Regulators Group, and when I was at the FCC, that's who we interacted with, and they had a mission really of sharing of best practices, and so as a result, that was really a much more limited role that they played. And what you've got now is that the code is really, and net neutrality did as well, but the code has really thrust BEREC into more of a new role, and really a decision-making role and an official advising role. And so what you've got is this movement away from a sharing of best practices into one where there's going to actually have to be decision-making, both in terms of setting the guidelines for the NRAs to be implementing, but also, importantly, oftentimes in explicitly being called upon to offer an official opinion to the Commission as they review the rules going forward. And so I think both of those demand a different kind of interaction, both with stakeholders and as we talked about in terms of a process. And I think that this is both an important opportunity for BEREC, but it comes with a very big challenge because of the history of serving a very different function. And so when I think about what issues will then arise as you're trying to balance the overall code's objectives of how you provide an opportunity for increased investment, but also the certainty that's necessary going forward, you come to a lot of process issues that were highlighted both by the previous panelists and by some of the speakers when they were talking. So, just for example, when you're talking about what is the process for filing comments, not only do you need to make sure that that's transparent so that all the stakeholders know who and when they're going to be able to be providing, but what are the resources for then reviewing those comments? Who ends up having those? And then when we talk about the capacity, it's not just the capacity to be reviewing them, but it's also the technical capacity to be understanding them, particularly on issues that are very technical like spectrum. And so the more technical the issues, the more you've got to make sure that there's the expertise involved in those people that are reviewing them as well. And then there's real challenges, I think, in terms of the transparency about who is deciding. And we heard that from somewhat from John, the speaker. I'm not sure who he was affiliated with, but the last one, when he talked about the expert working groups, what are the ex parte processes around them? When do they meet, and who are the ones that are really driving that process? And how do you provide transparency into that, and how do you have the opportunity for other stakeholders to participate when the working groups are considering an issue? How does a stakeholder get the opportunity to bring an issue to that group, or how do you get them to review a decision that they've made? And these are all significant challenges that are very important from a stakeholder's perspective, but ones that really didn't have to be dealt with when you were playing more of that best practices and sharing function. And so that's why I think as I said, I think we're at a pivotal moment from BEREC's perspective. When I was at the commission, we did have some similar challenges with multi-layered regulatory regimes. In that sense, the FCC was setting, after the 1996 Telecommunications Act passed in the United States, we set the broader framework, and we had critical things that were given just to us, but the states retained many issues as well within their purview, and we had similar tensions and debates about what was the role of the federal regulatory regime versus the state regulatory regime. And I thought I'd just observe a few of the lessons that we might have learned from that experience. And one is that I think that worked best when the federal regime was focused on a few principles. And one, and first and foremost, is what is the overall direction? I think that is critical. And by what that I mean is things like what is in scope, definitional decisions. Those are issues that are more easily dealt with at a federal level. And also, what is out of bounds? What are the rules of the road, and what are some things that are outside of the norm? Another critical component, particularly from the NRA's perspective, is going to be, though, that they're going to be ultimately in charge of enforcement, because BEREC doesn't have its own enforcement capability. So making sure that you've got a dialogue between those two is going to be important. And one of the examples I hearken back to at the Commission, which many of those involved in telecom regulation might be familiar with, is really the unbundling and pricing of elements, which was a big debate in the 90s and early 2000s. And in that was an example in which the Commission had it right in setting the basic parameters of the unbundling of network elements that might be necessary for competition, and maybe even around the pricing aspects of talking about it needs to be a forward-looking cost model for new investment. On the other hand, there were lots of fights because at the federal level they actually tried to go in and set the exact formula for the pricing at the state level, and without taking into account some of the variations that might occur because of geographic and other demographic differences. And that ended up being a real point of tension between the states and the federal government, and actually delayed both the implementation of those rules and ultimately the benefits of competition as a result of that. And that is one where I think that the Commission could have gotten 80% of what they wanted by setting forward those basic principles of what was not allowed. It had to be forward-looking cost, and here was an example of a model, but without requiring the details of the model on a state-by-state basis, and it deferred some more to the states on the implementing of that framework. And that's the kind of thing that I think ultimately, like I said, delayed both the regulatory regimes and ultimately the benefits of competition from the consumer perspective. And I know, Jeremy, you referenced that ultimately one of the tests we have to look at is what's really the impact not only on the companies and stakeholders, but the consumers. And I think that was one of the lessons that we learned. So with that, I guess I would just say that ultimately the goal does have to end up being trying to establish a broader, digital market, and how do we provide that certainty that's necessary. And I think that where you can focus on, as I said, kind of things like definitions rather than the details of formulas, I think that's going to be a better approach, and ultimately work better in terms of the NRA's enforcing and implementing the BEREC's vision. But I think that the process issues that David, you alluded to, and that some of the speakers raised are going to be significant challenges. But I'm confident, having worked with many of the regulators here, that I think that BEREC will be able to end up stepping up to those challenges. And so I think that they've already begun thinking about how that process will work, but I think that this will be something that's more evolutionary than it will be getting it right just right off the bat.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. So a strong call for BEREC not to get lost into details. We'll come back to that in the debate if we have time. I'm delighted now to introduce Ursula Paschel, that probably most of you know already, the Deputy Director General of BEUC, the European Consumer Organization. Ursula.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you very much for having invited BEUC, the European Consumer Voice, to this panel and to this conference. I'm very honored to be here to share our perspective on BEREC. And I would like maybe to start with a short reaction to what we just heard. So first of all, what is the expertise that BEUC can bring to the policy and to the regulatory process and to the tasks that BEREC has to fulfill? Just to explain that very briefly. So we are an umbrella organization. Our mission is to influence the European policy and decision-making process in the interests of European consumers. We have 42 member organizations. All of our member organizations are in daily contact with individual consumers, and that is how we function. So we compile all the feedback that we get on how the market functions, how the market delivers, how providers deliver consumers. We pull all that together, and that is one European voice that we try to communicate to institutions. So this is our expertise, and I think with that input...
Do national consumer organizations argue a lot, or are you often on the same page? We're all dying to know that. You know?
That's a good question. I think it's not a difficult question, luckily, because BEUC has been established in 1962. And of course, we have been growing quite strongly in the past years. But I can say what we have in our community and in our network is a very high degree of trust and mutual respect. So far, we have very rarely been in a situation where we had to use what we call the footnoting system, when in our position papers we have to make a footnote and say this and that member in that country does not agree with that position. If you maybe know our position papers in the telecommunications field, I don't think there is probably a lot where we had to resort to that.
Thank you, and congratulations.
Thank you very much. So what I was about to say is that with that work that we do, I think we also try to help the European institutions to do what is their obligation according to the European treaties, namely to ensure that consumer interests are taken on board across all European policies that affect consumers, and to aim at a high protection for European consumers. So that's just on the expertise that we provide. I found it also very interesting to hear about these three elements, which is credibility, legitimacy, and transparency, that are important in the regulatory process, very important. So if I can quickly comment, I would say that BEREC has, particularly with the TSM and the code now, really demonstrated that it can be an independent expert advisor to the European institutions. So we have really witnessed that there has been a strong profile now that has come up, which is very positive. And also with the monitoring activities that BEREC has done in relation to roaming, to termination rates, traffic management practices, that was all very profound and very well founded. On net neutrality in particular, I would like to raise that, though we would not agree with all aspects of the BEREC guidelines, we think that BEREC has done an excellent job, again, to demonstrate its independence and to be a strong voice. So. Last point, transparency. Just a comment on consultation work that BEREC does. We have seen also there an increase on consultations that BEREC runs, and particularly also in relation to strategic documents, so multi-annual programs, annual work programs. So that's very positive. And maybe a technical remark on that. We are actually also happy that you use for collaborative document sharing a platform that is Discuto, which we haven't tried out so often, but once, and that was quite a positive experience. We're having an argument with the European Commission on certain high-level expert groups where the sharing platform is Google Docs. I don't know if you know that Google Docs is, in our opinion, really infringing European data protection laws in terms of services that they use. And so we're very happy that you have chosen something else. It's important that institutions and regulators show the good way forward. And consultation periods are maybe a little bit too short still. We know that you have now minimum of 30 days, but for an umbrella like we are with so many members, it's sometimes difficult to meet these deadlines. So the call is again, please allow for, I see Marta is nodding.
It's not just consumers, operators and the
I mean, that was just to take all the three examples, or the categories, so credibility, legitimacy, and transparency. I would say well done, BEREC, and congratulations for the work that you have shown in the past 2 years and even before. Now, when we look into the future, of course, you will not be surprised from our perspective to hear that though the end-user working group has done very good work, that there should be a stronger consumer focus in the work of BEREC, and there is much more that we think is possible and much more that is necessary. What does that mean? So, to give you some examples, first of all, it's about topics that are important to European consumers. Just to say that we will, of course, look forward to work with BEREC in the implementing work that needs to be done for the code. We're also looking forward to comment on the Work Programme 2019, which has a lot of very important topics in it already. But what we see increasingly is a need to look at the big picture of topics like Internet of Things, where there are so many different concerns for consumers, starting from consumer rights to privacy, to safety, to security, to data protection, to connectivity. And there we would really ask also that BEREC takes that topic very much up front. And that also brings me to another point, which I think is important in terms of the need to work much more in an interdisciplinary way. We are always calling on regulators and enforcement networks to cooperate more. There is certainly a strong need also to bring in data protection authorities, telecom authorities, competition authorities, to look into the situation all together to come forward with coherent and comprehensive responses in this multi-layered regulatory framework and in these markets that increasingly are very complex and opaque for European consumers. So that just on topics. Another topic, just to mention, device neutrality, very important for consumers. We think consumers should really have a right to choose what apps they use and when they use them on their mobile phone. For example, we've seen the European Commission competition investigation into Android and the result of that. So RCEP has done excellent work, and we really think that should be something that BEREC also takes up at the European level. Another example from our practice where we worked with another sector is from the energy sector. You know that there is SEER, which is an informal, it's not an agency, it's not ACER, the energy regulators body. It's an informal an association actually, but it's the Council of European Energy Regulators, and they have come to us and we have asked them to do a vision together to help identify what are really the important consumer topics and to have kind of a guidance, a reference document to work together on these topics. That was some years ago, and I think it has been very successful. We're still seeing increasing work of the energy regulators on these topics that we have identified, and then there is a continuous dialogue. We work on many different topics, so from financial services to energy, to food, to other topics. So we really have a very broad, I would say, insight into how other regulators, how other agencies work, and I would maybe just give you some examples of what we think are best practices. So one example is, of course, the question, do you have a permanent stakeholder group? Do you have accredited stakeholders? And you may know that there is a lot of agencies that have that. For example, EFSA, the European Food Safety Agency, they have accredited stakeholders. They have a stakeholder forum. So they have a very regular exchange, and they involve stakeholders very regularly and systematically in strategic planning and activity implementation. They even have a bureau which has a separate consumer stakeholder group that is really focusing on consumers and feeds back into the EFSA activities and deliberations. So that is certainly a good way, which may not be possible if you're not an agency in that same way, but we think that it doesn't really matter if you're not a formal agency. There is not really a negative aspect to it, but having more formal relationships to stakeholders may be good. Another good example from the financial markets authorities, for example, from the European Banking Authority, and from the European Insurance Authority, EIOPA, is that they have an annual Consumer Protection Day, which they exclusively dedicate to discussing consumer topics and what matters to consumers, and they take the input from there. And the third point, and that I close with that point, is I know you do workshops already, but we think it would be good to do even more workshops where topics are discussed with stakeholders that also matter to consumers. So these are just 3 examples how to maybe better institutionalize the relationship and make it more systematic and regular, because I think that would really improve even the performance, if I may say, of BEREC. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ursula. On the length of consultation period, what would be, according to you, a more realistic duration?
I would say now, let's say we have 30 days, which is really a challenge. Sometimes, I mean, it's feasible sometimes, but it's not ideal.
45?
I would say, no, I would say 7 weeks.
7 weeks. Well, I see Jeremy nodding, so anyway, we'll come back to that. Thank you. Thank you for your... I'm now turning to Daniel Pataki. Daniel used to run the Hungarian regulator. He was also the chairman of ERG, BEREC's ancestor. Once upon a time, he was the director of ETNO, and he's now vice president of regulation for GSMA. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here. It feels like so many faces I know and so many good memories. So it feels like going back to a family gathering where you were absent for many years. And symbolically, we had lunch, and I was just randomly sitting down, and I found myself next to Kelly, the Icelandic head, who's, I think we have to congratulate him. He's the veteran here, he's doing it for 16 years now. And he just said that, you know, look at there's the Irish one. So it used to be like good old days, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, we just missed the Greeks. So forgive me if I will be emotionally biased, so my opinions might be not. I hope it will be still clear. So what I thought to talk about, and then also reflecting what has been said, less about the days of the consultations, but more, you know, rising a bit above, and starting not only with the how, which is, you know, the name of the panel is how you can optimize stakeholder engagement, but on the what and the why. So it was very interesting hearing David about, you know, what he thinks or he found are the 3 main pillars of a relationship between regulators and regulatee, and he said credibility, legitimacy, and trust. I have the privilege to now GSMA to work globally, so I see sometimes other parts of the world where you can learn as well. So I just met somebody from India who is a real expert, international expert about governance. So I asked him the same question, that what is his, you know, 30 years of experience, how does good governance look like, and what are the qualities? So it's almost the same as yours, but then I'll tell you. So it was purpose, legitimacy, capability, and resources. So why I was bringing this up, because I think the first thing I would say is what would be really interesting to see from BEREC is what is the purpose of BEREC. You know, Kevin told it, a pivotal moment. We see, so if there are 2, you know, different ways, one is the strategic advice and the other one is the implementation machine. We have seen how many things you have to implement. So how BEREC sees itself in the future, what is the role? The second one, which I wanted to highlight, is often when we think about not only regulation but in any institution of how future will look like, we always think about the resources, and we don't think so often about the capabilities. So I think once you have, or we all have a clear view how this whole regulation will look like and what is BEREC role in the future, then I think it would be very interesting to see, whether the capabilities are there to do that work. Then a few thoughts on the how, on the stakeholder engagement. Johannes, in his introductory words, he said that he thinks now this is really important. This is the one message from me, and as well from GSMA, which might sound empty, but I think it's still true, that the stakeholder engagement, which I would rather call it, or should be more like a cooperation, or even at the extent partnership in the future, in some cases, is really more needed than ever. And why would I say that? So the last time I was on the other side of the table was like 10 years ago, when the last code was implemented. So many things have changed. Some of it goes without saying. But I think when you think about stakeholder engagement, I think it is just worth to look at it for a few minutes. So I was just saying at the lunch that I don't envy any of the regulators now, because we thought 10 years ago that our job is very complex and difficult. But looking, what the future will bring, or we don't even know. So the future is much more uncertain than 10 years ago with AI, 5G, and you name it. So it's much more difficult. The second one, the industry, or your core stakeholders, so the telco industry where I work now, on the other side, has a very different perspective than 10 years ago. So we are not a growing business anymore. And also, we are not as, if I can say that here, not as sexy as we used to be. So that means two things. If we are not growing, that means limited resources, not only from the regulatory side, but the regulatory side. And also, how you can attract talent. I don't know how is it with the regulators. 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't that a problem. In the industry, if you do, now the most talented people are not choosing us. So I think that's also, when you think about the capabilities on the long run, I think it will be interesting to see. Last but not least, 10 years ago, EU's perspective as a whole was quite different than nowadays as well. So if I would be diplomatic on this stage, we are at an inflection point. If I won't be, then we are in a crisis. So I think, many things, who you work more than us in a political environment as well, so how the new parliament, or how the Europe's direction, or what is Europe's identity, I think that will be interesting questions ahead, which will all, influence we are doing. So that's why I think that, more than just an optimization of a stakeholder engagement is needed, because we are all in the same boat. So just to wrap up, I think the clarity of role is important. Then based on that, the capabilities. Then the third one, some of the people, I often disagree with John Strand, who is affiliated to himself, basically. But I think the focus, so it's written in the law, it's all true, but I think, how could you do like 30 tasks at the same time? And then it was said with some other people as well that, evidence-based and impact, and it's also, again, a balance. If you have to do so many things, and your capabilities and resources are limited, how can you make the job really well, like impact assessment and, evidence-based research. I think that is really important. And last but not least, as I said, so working together, not only as many people reflected, like, involving us in an earlier phase, but I think you need to involve us, even if it might sound a bit difficult, deeper in a way, so we can help well. And as you said quite correctly, what we can offer to this. So I think GSMA can offer the global perspective, not only the European one, which will be more and more relevant, I think, in the future as well, because globally everyone faces the same issues. Even if regulation still remains global, the issues are global. And also, I think we have quite an expertise based in London. For instance, the data economy study, we have done it 2 years ago, so we can offer some insights so you don't have to do the same mistakes maybe.